Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Thank you for coming to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor. Just call me Warren. And I'm the president and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. So just some housekeeping things before we kick off tonight. I'd like to thank our partners, Knoxville Community Media, who are helping us record this, and also I'd like to thank First Bank, who sponsor our lectures and Brown Bag Talks. And also I'd like to remind you that if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, we would love for you to become a member. I have to say that I'm obligated, it's in my contract, but you should really become a member because it's a lot of fun and we do a lot of cool stuff. And your support helps us to continue to bring amazing projects and programs like this. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some upcoming programs that we've got going on. On September 23rd, we're going to be doing a workshop on how to use the McClung Historical Collection upstairs for your own genealogical research. On October 18th, we'll be having a historical newspaper workshop, and you'll have to, these are registration required. And then we'll also be doing a Researching Your Own History workshop on October 20th. And of course, on October 25th, we'll be having Monsters at the Museum, which is going to be a whole lot of fun, a fun-filled day for everybody. So bring the kids. I also, before we get started, and I'm just curious to know, who here is a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society? Okay. Who here knows Dr. Kelly? That's what I thought. Who here's related to Dr. Kelly?
Bravo!
Yeah, exactly. Now let's give everybody a big round of applause. Well, we're really excited to be hosting Dr. Kelly and to listen to this talk. It's one of the things I'm personally interested in, and as I'm interested in sort of the British relationship, the British Empire's relationship with the Native Americans here. But we're also excited to have him because he's an erstwhile son of ETHS and was an intern in 2010, he was telling me. So we're excited in many ways to welcome him home. I probably don't need to tell you much about Dr. Kelly since you all know him. But I will remind you that he is an assistant professor of history at Valparaiso University in Indiana, and that he teaches early American history, Native American history, and public history. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina and his MA in history from Virginia Tech. And again, he was an intern with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Kelly. We're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And I should say one final thing. His books are available for sale. So if you want him to sign, you want to come get some books, we got them. They're out front. Okay. Without further ado, Dr. Kelly.
Gosh, thanks everybody, and thank you, Dr. for what an amazing introduction. It really is an honor to be here with you today. I feel like my experiences working and being associated with the East Tennessee Historical Society was really formative for me when I was an undergrad and then burgeoning historian at Virginia Tech. So I do encourage you to become a member and at least support the programming, the really great programming that happens like right here in Knoxville with this history. It is funny to see so many friendly faces. It feels like just another, I was married 2010, unfortunately, or 10 years ago. Unfortunately, my wife can't make tonight, but it does seem like this is like another wedding reception, which is pretty exciting. So again, thank you so much for being here. I feel really honored to be talking about this project. This is actually the first sort of formal discussion I've had about my book. It came out in May of 2025. I spent a long time working on it, so it's really awesome to be able to speak with you about it tonight. So I want to start today in an unexpected place and in an unexpected time. William Blount High School on January 29th, 2020. The day before, I'd driven across the mountains from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I was in grad school. I was almost finishing up at that time. And I was there to judge a history class competition for my friend Matt Talley, who taught various history and geography subjects at William Blount. Matt is here, and so he's right there in the back with his WB polo on. I didn't tell him I was talking about it, so it just happened that way. The event was really fun. The students were excited, and I enjoyed the experience of seeing Matt, or Mr. Talley, how he made history come alive for his class of ninth grade. I often think about the fact that I teach college students, and I can't imagine teaching high school students. People who do that, we really should celebrate them. I also learned that day, so it was really exciting, but I also learned that William Blount High School, or at least the land on which the school is located, has a history that predates the site's present-day importance. According to an informational panel near one of the school's exits, I found out that an international border, a boundary between the Cherokee Nation and the United States, once crossed the school's property. So this is an image of the display that I saw there. You can see that's the flag of the Cherokee Nation. That's obviously the flag of the United States. And this display talks about this treaty boundary. There is, that's a zoomed in image of the image on the bottom right. And I was presenting, I guess, like right here in this building, and I think Mr. Talley's classroom was on that wing as well. So I was right there. And when I found out about the presence of this boundary, I was stunned. This wasn't just of casual interest to me. You know, I'm a historian. All history is of casual interest to me, right? I like visiting historical sites. But I was literally in the process of researching this very survey for my doctoral dissertation. I arrived at William Blount High School expecting to do a favor for a friend, and I left feeling the powerful contemporary relevance of the history that I was in the process of writing about. Here I am, 2020, standing there, and I wish I could blame my haircut on COVID, but this was pre-COVID. So bless my heart, as we say. I don't know what look I was going for then. So at one time, the survey of this border was of national importance, both for the nation of the United States and for the Cherokee Nation. During the summer and fall of 1797, a team of Cherokee and American surveyors traversed the hills and valleys of what's now Middle and East Tennessee and marked this border on the landscape. There's an image of a map that was published, I think, in 1794, and then at some point, someone added the treaty boundaries that these surveyors constructed. So this is the boundary there in Middle Tennessee. The border sort of goes up into what's now, eastern Kentucky and down. And this would have been the part of the border that was impacted where William Blount High School is today. President John Adams had appointed James Winchester of Tennessee, Andrew Pickens of South Carolina, and Benjamin Hawkins, a U.S. Indian agent, to represent the United States on the treaty survey. And a National Council of Cherokee leaders had appointed their own representatives. Bloody Fellow, also called Nintoya, Turtle at Home, Selakuki-Wohaling, Doublehead, and Kalakati were there to advocate for their nation's interest along this survey here. And in addition to these Native and American diplomats, there were professional surveyors there, familiar with the complicated meets and bounds surveying process of the late 18th century. There were hired laborers there to care for horses, hunt wild game, and carry baggage. And the party even included a doctor there to provide medical care. And the size of this group, more like a small army, I think speaks to the survey's significance. A lot of people were involved in constructing this boundary. And moreover, the boundary itself had to satisfy both the American and Cherokee officials. In fact, at several times during the survey, the Cherokee surveyors, they threatened to leave the group if the American officials didn't agree to draw the boundary to suit the Native nation's interest. Fearing that the surveyed border would locate too much of the Cumberland Plateau's valuable hunting land outside of the nation, Cherokee boundary commissioners on May 27th, and this is according to one American official, grew discontented with their situation. And they threatened to, in their words, return to their nation to consult Cherokee leaders before they proceeded any further. Fearing that Cherokees might leave, the Americans revised the border survey to satisfy the interests of their Native colleagues. And as the group painstakingly went about their work that lasted for 6 months, between May and November of 1797, they literally inscribed the border on the landscape, marking C for the Cherokee Nation on one side of trees and US on the other side of trees. This isn't something that just exists on a map. It literally exists, it existed on the landscape of early Tennessee. So, and this is an image of one of these surveyors' journals. You can see here, I think you probably can see it. So this surveyor is talking about how on for every mile on a tree, the letter C for the Cherokee Nation were carved into it, and U.S. for the United States. So this is a physical border, not just a border that exists, again, on a map. And this survey, it fascinated me. And my research into it became a foundational part of my book. The title of the book is itself, Marking Native Borders. So it speaks to the importance of surveys here. And I think there's a tendency among many non-Native people to think that Native Americans lived on their traditional homelands, but really didn't have any idea of land's value and kind of shared land with everybody because they lacked, what we might think of as modern ideas about the value of territory, and certainly didn't have any interest in marking national borders. But in this example, we have Native Americans directing a survey of their own national lands. We have them pressuring American officials to draw the boundaries to suit their interests, and then later on, using these borders to argue for the eviction of white intruders from their nation. And this happens. The United States periodically sent federal troops to round up illegal intruders and burn their settlements that were on native land. In January of 1798, for example, only a few months after the survey's completion, Captain Thomas T. Underwood, acting under the orders of his superior officers, he explained that he and his men, and these are his words, had a laborious time this winter in moving the settlers off the Indian lands near the Hiwassee River. Though the intruders had timely notice to move off, a number of the settlers were obstinate. At length, they were removed, some of their cabins burnt, and their fencing, which ended our business. Think about that. Federal troops rounding up illegal white intruders in the Cherokee Nation, destroying their property, and transporting back to the United States. I think this really shows the power of these native-drawn boundaries. And I imagine today that most Americans assume that national borders are a relatively modern invention, or at the very least, that European nations and their colonial offspring, think the United States, Australia, Canada, that they were at the forefront of bordering the globe. And I don't necessarily disagree in general with that. But indigenous people of North America very quickly realized the power of a marked border. Clear boundaries allowed them to police their national borders against white intruders and demonstrate the limits of their national control of lands. And out of my initial research into this one survey from 1797, came two of the main arguments of my book. First, I argued that Chickasaws and Cherokees successfully resisted American expansion and maintained their lands for decades after U.S. independence by adapting their own indigenous uses of land with new notions of land ownership brought by European colonists. And second, I also argue that American expansion, at least in the early South, was not directed by the federal government, but by local white settlers. In fact, many U.S. officials periodically evicted white intruders from native land, like in 1798. However, these intruders created a series of local governments, and I would include the state of Tennessee among those local governments, in order to pressure the federal government to negotiate land cessions with the Chickasaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation. And my book proves this argument through 6 chapters. I think it's amazing that my book's on sale. Buy a copy, it'll make me rich. Actually, I get $1 from every book sold, so if you don't want to buy a book, you can just give me $1. But my book proves this argument through 6 chapters that together trace the interactions between Cherokees, Chickasaws, white settlers, and land speculators beginning in the 1770s, so think right before the beginning of the American Revolution, and until the 1820s. And the focus of my book is on a region that I call the Tennessee country. And by Tennessee country, I don't just mean the present-day state of Tennessee. I mean the parts of the state of Tennessee within the watersheds of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, as well as the smaller rivers that flow west into the Mississippi River. So pretty much the state of Tennessee and portions of North Carolina, Kentucky, Georgia, and Alabama. There's an image that is included in the book, and you can see here the various river systems and the way that I'm thinking about this space here. And I came up with this concept of the Tennessee country because I think we have a tendency to overemphasize the historical importance of state boundaries. Yes, Today, these borders seem really important. My friend Kevin drove all the way from Raleigh today, so he crossed, I guess, 3 borders. You went from North Carolina into Virginia, because the road's out, into Tennessee. So we think these borders are really important today, but they weren't. It took a long time for these borders to be formally created, and they were often irrelevant to most of the region's inhabitants, and this includes Native Americans as well as non-Native people. Inhabitants of what's now northern Alabama certainly would have had more in common, and it'd been easier for them to connect with people who were living north or up the river in East Tennessee or down the river in what's now western Tennessee than with other people in Alabama who were living hundreds of miles away on the Gulf Coast, for example. And state borders also meant very little to Chickasaws and Cherokees, of course, whose ancestors had been living in the area for hundreds of years before these states even existed. And likewise, my book explores Native American history between the American Revolution and Indian removal of the 1830s. And I think too often textbooks and history instructors, I guess I would include myself here, we tend to think about Native Americans during the War for Independence and then race on ahead into the process of Indian removal. That sort of makes the implication that Indian removal was a natural, sort of inevitable outcome of the American Revolution. And I wholeheartedly disagree with this perspective. I think instead we should appreciate Native people's creative and successful strategies to persist against American expansion for decades. And I believe my book effectively demonstrates these strategies. In my book, it's also a story of many of the most prominent white leaders of Tennessee, such as John Sevier, William Blount, and Andrew Jackson. These 3 and other men like them worked to create local governments that could facilitate ongoing expansion. John Sevier and other leaders of the state of Franklin, the extra-legal government in Upper East Tennessee that never received federal recognition, they created their state because neither North Carolina nor the United States would authorize new settlements on Cherokee land. William Blount, the federally appointed governor of the Southwest Territory, which was the government sort of that governed Tennessee before it, the area that became Tennessee before it was a state, he began to support Tennessee's statehood when he could not convince Congress to adequately protect territory residents from Cherokee attacks or negotiate additional land cessions with Native nations. Finally, Andrew Jackson used his position in Tennessee's congressional delegation to pressure U.S. officials to pursue a policy of aggressive and unending expansion into Chickasaw and Cherokee territory. He even represented the United States during negotiations with the Chickasaw Nation in 1816 and in 1818, where Chickasaw ceded all of their remaining Tennessee country territory to the United States. And my book also includes numerous examples of Cherokee soldiers, in particular, using violence to defend their land from intruding white settlers and land speculators. We're thinking about what this place would have been like in the 1790s. The Tennessee country really was a violent, disorderly war zone until about 1795. However, I know my audience. I have no doubt that almost all of you are from East Tennessee, or at least have a general familiarity with the state's history. So I'm going to leave these more well-known stories of prominent Tennesseans for you to read about in the book, hopefully, and instead explore the Native American side of this history. This was a history that I really had no knowledge about before I started this project. So I think for me, this is the most interesting part of my project, and I hope that you'll find it interesting as well. So in the time that I have left, I want to focus on several of the ways Chickasaws and Cherokees protected their territories against American intruders. So I'm going to talk about how Native peoples surveyed their nation's borders to better protect their land, how they improved their lands by constructing highways, ferries, and a couple other sort of transportation projects, if you will, and how they owned parcels of land individually to better protect their territory from white intruders. So as my overview of the 1797 boundary demonstrated, Cherokees and Chickasaws surveyed borders as a way to identify where their territory ended and where other nations' territory began. Clear border boundaries allowed Native peoples to identify illegal white settlers and then call on the federal government to evict them. But borders were not just important between Native land and the United States. In fact, Chickasaws in particular insisted that Americans needed to recognize their nation's borders not just with the United States, but with other Native nations as well. Whereas Cherokees, at least until about the 1810s, were more content with only having clear boundaries between Cherokee land and the United States. So I think that's important to note here. Chickasaws and Cherokees, they disagreed about how to bound land and whether to bound sort of all of their nation's borders. And I think that's important. when I teach my students, I try to tell them that, we talk about Native Americans sort of as if they're one monolithic group, but that's not the case at all. Different Native peoples had their own interests because they're different, and that's important to talk about. And the differing perspectives between Chickasaws and Cherokees, they were made obvious during negotiations at the Treaty of Hopewell, which was the first negotiation between the newly independent United States and members of both nations. Negotiations with Cherokee diplomats began in November of 1785, and early on, Cherokees were clear in their belief that a formal border enforced by federal troops was the only way to check the hordes of white settlers and land speculators that had been invading their national lands for the past decade. The white people have encroached on our lands on every side of us, according to Ches Cohenwee, who was there representing the town of Timotley on the Little Tennessee River. And he hoped that the United States would, and these are his words, adjust and settle our limits so that we may be secured in the possession of our own lands. And other Cherokee diplomats at the Hopewell Treaty were more succinct in arguing for a border with the United States. We will mark a line for the white people, they said. And they did just that. During the week-long negotiations, Cherokees outlined a boundary line between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. This is the border of the Treaty of Hopewell. That's the part that's sort of in Middle Tennessee. And this is an awesome resource. It was created by a scholar at the University of Georgia. It's called Invasion of America, and he has listed out every single land cession ever made by Native Nation, but that gave land to the United States, that ceded land from Native nations to the United States. So I think this is an amazing teaching tool, and it provides a lot of information on each of these treaties as well. So, if you're casually interested in this, that's a really great resource.
And the border is the line?
The border is the line, that's exactly right. So that's sort of the boundary of the land cession. So this was land that was ceded to the United States in 1785 by the Cherokee Nation, and this was territory that remained part of the Cherokee Nation. So that makes sense.
And the Brown land is?
And the Brown land was part of the United States sort of before he begins after the United States, and when the United States got independence in 1783, that's when his project starts. So that would have been United States territory before 1783, if that makes sense. So like Kentucky was part of Virginia at that time, so that wouldn't have been included as a land cession.
So everything around Knoxville?
The United States government told the Cherokees that it was still Cherokee land, even though there were many white settlers that were living here in East Tennessee at that time.
And the city of Knoxville exists?
Yeah, the city of Knoxville was I can't remember when White's Fort was established, 1791? I'm sure somebody knows. Anybody know? 17. But yes, it was within the Cherokee Nation at that time. Yeah, in 1785. But there were many white settlers that were living, especially in Greenville. I mean, this is all where the state of up there, of course, is where up this way is where the state of Franklin would have been in Upper East Tennessee. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect, great. Yeah, and happy to answer questions like as they come. I'm not teaching this semester. That's like an awesome opportunity to answer questions. I haven't had my teaching itch scratched in a while.
I'll give you one more.
Yes, do it. Uh-huh.
So did the Cherokee say, okay, we don't care if you have a city here or not, that's our land, get them all?
Exactly, that's exactly what they said.
And of course that didn't happen.
Exactly, yeah. There was another treaty in 1791, the Treaty of Holston, that did cede the territory around Knoxville from the Cherokee Nation to the United States. But for like 6 years, the Cherokees were saying you got to move them, and periodically the United States did. But the United States was really weak and didn't have a tremendous amount of power, not only to deal with their own settlers that are moving on a native land, but really to do anything after the sort of downturn after the American Revolution, after soldiers were got out of service. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 86. Okay.
1986.
So, James, for White's Fort. Okay. Nice. Okay.
What were some of the reasons that the federal government would even be willing, assuming they had the ability, to come in and remove white settlers?
It's expensive. I think dealing with many federal officials knew that people on what they would have called the frontier were responsible for creating violence between Native people and the United States. And if you're thinking about what's expensive, well, dealing with disorder, dealing with violence is really costly. So at a time when the United States was extremely cash-strapped, they thought peace was actually the cheaper option rather than sort of continuing violence, especially in the South. I mean, a more cynical interpretation would be many federal officials owned land and speculated in land in the Ohio Valley, and they didn't really do that in the South for the most part. The people were in power, so that's why we have many of the conflicts taking place with Native people in the Ohio Valley, and the federal government directing wars against Native Americans there, and not really doing that in the South, at least in this time period, yet in the South. Yeah. So that's the official treaty boundary, but during the negotiations, Oldtassel, he was the most prominent Cherokee diplomat at the Treaty of Hopewell, he even drew a map for American officials, which was a really forceful strategy to assert territorial control in a way that was really similar to how European powers were drawing up maps to assert their power and authority in North America. And that is Oldtassel's map that he drew at the Treaty of Hopewell. It's a really fascinating map. I think one of the major takeaways for me, the first thing I notice is that the thing that makes the most sense to him is that the world is organized. It's a watery environment. The American South is a watery environment where rivers and river systems are the defining feature of the landscape. This line is kind of the Appalachian Mountain Ridge, if you will. That's sort of what that line represents. But all the other ways that Oldtassel is conceiving of his world, the world, again, which he'd lived for 6 decades, was a watery environment. If you're thinking about some of the other sites, that's Natchez. So this is the Mississippi River. This is Augusta. So those are the two sort of major towns that Oldtassel included on the map. And there are various other key spots here as well. Knoxville, notably, is not included, but it would have been right here because that's the Holston River, and this is the French Broad. So that would have been where Knoxville was today here. So I think this is just a fantastic source. After the negotiations were done with the Cherokee nations, with the Cherokee representatives who were there at the Hopewell Treaty, the Chickasaw diplomats, they similarly articulated their national boundaries in a separate negotiation. So we have 2 treaties of Hopewell, one with the Cherokee Nation and one with the Chickasaw Nation. However, when the Americans produced this map to the Chickasaws, Piamenko, he was the leading Chickasaw at the treaty conference, he was unsatisfied because it did not include the Chickasaw Nation's entire border. Piamenko, again, I'm quoting from him, wished Congress would point out his lands to him. He wanted to know his own. But instead of allowing Piamenko to describe their national territory, the U.S. commissioners merely told the Chickasaw diplomats that they must agree with the neighboring tribes respecting their boundary, which could be determined at a later date. And before leaving the treaty ground, the Cherokees did identify a Chickasaw claim on Oldtassel's map. So that's this line. So that, in the way Oldtassel's thinking, that's the line, the boundary that divides Cherokee land from Chickasaw land. And that's the Tennessee River. So the boundary would have bisected the Tennessee River here. But Chickasaws, they never agreed to this arbitrary boundary. In fact, Chickasaw and Cherokee leaders would never agree on the border between their 2 nations. I think that's a really important point. In past decades, Cherokees and probably most indigenous people, they were willing to share hunting land with other native nations. Even during negotiations at the Hopewell Treaty, Cherokee officials worried that Chickasaws were going to claim an exclusive right to territory in the Cumberland Valley around Nashville. And they insisted that the region is a kind of common right in all the Indians, and the Chickasaws had no right of it themselves to own the territory exclusively. They were saying, Chickasaws may be saying that this is only theirs, but it's not. It should be shared by all of us. And often hunting land like that, which was in the Cumberland Plateau, in the Cumberland Valley, it often provided a buffer between Cherokee land and American settlements. So this is another map from an earlier period, the 1760s, I believe is when this map's from. And you can see on the map that there are the sort of center of the Cherokee Nation here, and the map maker includes all of the different Cherokee towns. There's Fort Loudon, so if you've ever been to Fort Loudon, it's included right there. This is sort of the center of the Overhill region of the Cherokee Nation. But the map maker also is really clear that there's this enormous hunting ground to the north of the sort of central part of the Cherokee Nation that's kind of provides a buffer between Cherokee land and the American settlers that would have been living in southwestern Virginia. There's the Chickasaw Nation is also included on the map as well.
Who produced this map?
I'm sorry.
Who produced
I can't remember who drew it. I think, but it's from the 1760s. I can get you that information though. Yeah. This is housed at the University of Pittsburgh, by the way. So it was Yeah, but I can for sure provide you with who it was. Yeah. There's this concept of hunting land that's kind of shared. But as Americans forced Native nations to cede land in the 1780s and 1790s, it became more important, at least the way the Chickasaws were thinking, to identify their borders. So other peoples, like the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, that these people could not sell their meaning Chickasaw, land to the United States. They needed to know where their land, they wanted everyone to understand the boundaries of their own nation, so other nations couldn't then cede land to the United States. And matters came to a head between the Chickasaws and Cherokees in late summer of 1792, when Chickasaws met once more with U.S. officials at Nashville, which at this time was a tiny outpost on the banks of the Cumberland River. And this is actually the story that opens my book. The main goal for the Chickasaws at this Nashville conference, again demanded by Piamenko, who was there, was to have the boundaries settled. And he described the Chickasaw Nation's borders, including the Chickasaw borders with other Native nations. But the Cherokees, who were also there at this conference in Nashville, they challenged Piamenko because of his emphasis on boundary lines between Native nations. Nantuaka, who was a prominent Cherokee official from Chestoe Town on the Hiwassee River, he saw no reason why Native Americans could not share territory, specifically the valuable hunting territory in Middle Tennessee. And these are his words. He never knew before the present that our people, meaning Native Americans, divided land and made lines like white people. Chickasaws countered that clear boundary lines were essential. Piamenko had intentionally described the Chickasaw Nation's borders during the Hopewell Treaty 7 years before, and he said, in order to save my own land, knowing the fondness of the Cherokees to sell land. He did not want closed borders, and he welcomed all indigenous peoples to hunt in the Chickasaw Nation. Yet with other Native nations making all of these land cessions to the federal government, it was more important than ever for all parties to understand the proper limits of the Chickasaw Nation. And before leaving Nashville, the Chickasaw leader, Wolf's Friend, he lectured the Cherokee Nantuaka that it is right to mark our boundaries on the map. By demanding a clear border between the Chickasaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation, Piamenko and Wolf's Friend envisioned a future where Native nations marked their territorial limits and maintained property rights over their national lands. White Americans' appetite for native land would only increase in the coming years, but peaceful diplomacy and clear boundaries offered a potential check on speculators' and settlers' invasion of Chickasaw hunting territory. And this would be the case until Chickasaw ceded their last remaining Tennessee country territory to the United States in 1818. Their clear borders provided a check on Americans' illegal settlement and speculation in their nation. So again, one way that Native peoples contested American expansion was through clear borders. Second point, another way that Native peoples of the Tennessee country protected their lands was by controlling how non-Native peoples traveled through their nations and how the federal government essentially operated in their territories. And to prove this point, I want to focus on two examples. One is the Natchez Trace, which connected Natchez and Nashville through the Chickasaw Nation, and a shorter road in the Cherokee Nation between Athens, Georgia, and East Tennessee. And this is a map of the Natchez Trace. If you travel in and around Nashville, you will see signs. I believe it's a federal monument, maybe, is how it's officially designated. But you can see, of course, there's Natchez there in lower Mississippi, and there's Nashville up here. And the Chickasaws, their territory was in what's now northeastern Mississippi and western Tennessee. In fact, they had a major town there where Memphis is. So Chickasaw leaders approved of the Natchez Trace in October of 1801 at a treaty conference at Chickasaw Bluff, which was the name for their town at Memphis. And it took only one evening's negotiation for the Chickasaws' principal speaker, George Colbert, known as Tutimus Stubby, to agree that a wagon road may be cut through their land. And on the surface, Chickasaws' agreement appears to display their willingness to surrender control of their national lands to the United States. But it was more complicated. Chickasaws were accustomed to travelers crossing their national lands on trips to and from the Gulf Coast. They likely thought it of little consequence to allow the United States to merely expand the existing path into a highway suitable for wagon transportation. This is a map of sort of the existing path. So again, just to orient you, here's Nashville there. And there was a path from Nashville that went southwest from Nashville into Chickasaw land. And it was known as Mountain Leaders Trace. And Piamenko, the sort of most prominent Chickasaw diplomat, especially in the 1790s, was also known as Mountain Leaders. So the fact that this was called Mountain Leaders Trace shows the prominence of him. And it, I think, shows that Chickasaws were aware, yeah, Americans are moving through our lands already, so it's not that big of a deal to allow the federal government to sort of expand the road, make it easier for transportation. And furthermore, the Chickasaw Council, they appointed 2 native representatives to oversee the road's construction several months later, which allowed national leaders to ensure that the new highway conformed to Chickasaw interpretations of the treaty agreement. Plus, even though Chickasaw diplomats agreed to the new road, their nation retained control over significant dimensions of their nation's transportation network. And when pressed by commissioners to allow white Americans to operate lodgings, sort of they were kind of called like roadside stands, sort of like rest stops, maybe how we would think about this today. The Chickasaws refused to allow Americans to do so. They insisted that, and this is their words, for the meantime, travelers will always find provisions in the nation sufficient to carry them through. Likewise, Chickasaws would maintain control over all ferries along the road's route. In fact, only 2 years after the completion of the 1801 treaty, Chickasaw George Colbert was taking in fees for ferriage across the Tennessee River and for operating roadside lodgings for American travelers. By 1803, numerous Chickasaw families had moved from Longtown, which is kind of in the center part of the Chickasaw Nation, close to where Tupelo, Mississippi is today. That was the center of Chickasaw settlement. Many of the people who were living in Longtown had moved to Colbert's Ferry, where they created a new community at the ferry crossing and sold provisions to American travelers. Yet another map, but this is a map that displays Chickasaw land cessions to the United States, but clearly on the map is Colbert's Ferry. And this is the Natchez Trace. So there's the road that goes from Natchez to Nashville here. It goes up through Columbia. And Colbert's Ferry is there along the Tennessee River because George Colbert operated this ferry. And Colbert, he'd been one of Longtown's most prominent leaders. And so the resettlement of Chickasaws near his ferry reflected the draw of his leadership and the likelihood that former residents of Longtown would benefit from his financial success. He's operating a ferry. Let's settle around his ferry and sell our provisions to Americans as well. So Chickasaws may have allowed the United States to construct the Natchez Trace, but they effectively maintained the ability to regulate transportation through their nation. And in October of 1803, the Cherokees agreed for the United States to construct a similar highway through their nation that would begin in East Tennessee and terminate near Athens. The source that talks about this is really cool. It talks about the new college at Athens, meaning the University of Georgia. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I noticed from the archive. And if you see here, this is a map of these roads. So it split off, and part of it went towards East Tennessee, and part of it went sort of towards Middle Tennessee. And so there's an existing road there as well, but this is sort of where I'm talking about. That's the section of the Tennessee-Georgia road that I'll be referencing here. And U.S. and state officials had been increasing their pressure for the Georgia-Tennessee road for the previous 18 months. But this was also a time when many Native leaders were beginning to realize the benefits from other transportation projects through their nation. Several months before, Cherokee officials began contracting with white Americans to operate roadside lodgings along a highway from Knoxville to Nashville. According to one contract, for example, a Cherokee named Tolan-Tuskegee, he possessed a grant from his nation to establish houses of entertainment and arranged with Thomas Clark, who was a federal postmaster, to operate 2 of these roadside stands for 5 years. The 2 men, according to the contract, would split all profits equally, and Tolan-Tuskegee agreed to reside nearby to keep good order between Cherokee and American travelers. And the contract explicitly stated that Thomas Clark had no right, title, or claim to land in the Cherokee Nation. And this is an image of this document. I think it's important to just show these documents that we have Native people and non-Native people negotiating, writing a contract, and setting up what this type of, not even essentially, was a business relationship would look like, and stating out exactly the parameters, what this relationship would look like. So you can see in the top left, there's Tolan-Tuskegee and Thomas Clark included, and then at the bottom, talking about how Clark will possess no right, title, or claim to any of this land around this roadside stand. And I think that agreements like this contributed to Cherokee's subsequent approval of the Georgia-Tennessee Road during treaty negotiations with the United States in October of 1803. In fact, the treaty itself further bolstered Cherokees' control over their nation's transportation networks. As Native diplomats approved the new road, they made sure that the United States acknowledged their national rights to ferries and roadside stands, as well as the income that came from such enterprises. So Cherokees, like the Chickasaws, were going to lease these ferries, generate revenue from American travelers that were traveling on this road. So Cherokees, like Chickasaws, would control who traveled through their nation and at what price. And some Cherokee individuals, like John Lowry, even pressured American officials to survey the road near their homesteads. Lowry, who had lived in what's now southeastern Tennessee, planned to move permanently to a site on the Hiwassee River should the road be located nearby. And by 1807, he did operate a ferry across the river. So Cherokees had resisted the Tennessee-Georgia road for several years, but many Cherokee leaders now believed that the highway's financial benefit outweighed the potential for violence caused by increased traffic through their nation. And in fact, Native peoples' benefit from white Americans' travels through their nations likely increased Cherokees' and Chickasaws' opposition to U.S. expansion. Again, so Cherokee and Chickasaws' ability to control these projects maybe made them even more committed to maintaining their national lands. While pondering the potential for future land cessions, one Tennessee resident believed that, and these are his words, the warriors of several tribes wish to exchange their lands for lands on the other side of the Mississippi River, but the chiefs are not willing, as they receive an annual pension for the roads that leads through their country. And Daniel Smith, he was one of Tennessee's sitting U.S. senators. He was even more specific. He attributed Chickasaws' opposition to a proposed 1805 land cession, these are his words, to the pernicious consequences arising from the ferries and stands on the road belonging to Indians. So white Americans are seeing Native people operating these things and saying they're making money from this, so obviously they're not going to want to make these types of land cessions. I think this is just a really interesting and fascinating relationship that we're seeing here. And furthermore, in August of 1806, Cherokees created the Cherokee Turnpike Company, which charged travelers for the use of the 220-mile road from Georgia to East Tennessee and used the income to keep the highway in good condition. This is an image of the document that creates the Cherokee Turnpike Company, and you can see here at the bottom right, the individual Cherokees who were responsible for maintaining portions of this turnpike and keeping the road in good condition based on the fees that they were accumulating from travelers here. And this is at the University of Tennessee, so there's an amazing collection of Cherokee documents just down the hill at UT Knoxville, and everybody's welcome to go look at them whenever you like. I think that's a really, really cool thing that I wasn't aware of. And later that year, Cherokees and Council at Lookout Mountain Town, they underscored the connection between their nation's commercial benefit from transportation networks and their national sovereignty. If there is any benefit to be got, we ought to have it of our own land, they declared. If there's any benefit to be had of our lands, we're the ones who need to benefit, not anyone else. And I think that's really important talking about. So they may have been approving these transportation projects, but as long as Native people were benefiting, that was great. That was great for how the Cherokees and Chickasaws were thinking about their national territories. So Cherokees and Chickasaws, they protected their territories from American expansion by actually shaping how white Americans traveled through their nations. So finally, and the third point, a third way that Cherokees and Chickasaws maintained control of their territory was to take land as individuals. And essentially, this is where the end of my book project here with this point. Again, as I mentioned, I think there's a tendency to think that Native Americans really didn't understand the economic value of their land and certainly did not own land individually. And this really isn't true at all. Native Americans witnessed land speculators coming into their nation and surveying their lands all the time. And they knew that plots of land had their own value. In 1804, for example, when Chickasaws resisted Americans' pleas for another land cession, the Chickasaw leader Cheneby made clear that if his people were ever going to sell land on the north side of the Tennessee River, they would, according to what he said, have it surveyed and have so much an acre for it, the same as the white people does to one another with their lands. Cheneby's seeing surveyors come, carve up Chickasaw territory. He's saying if we're ever going to sell our land, we're going to do the same thing. And Chickasaws and Cherokees did understand the fact that land could be used by individuals. Native women in particular often controlled plots of land for family gardens, and individual towns often claimed specific territory for hunting. So a town would have its own sort of hunting territory within the nation. So Native Americans, they understood land's value and even periodically used land individually or in smaller groups. It's certainly true, however, that neither Chickasaws nor Cherokees owned deeds for their particular homesteads. That is until the late 1810s. In treaties in 1816 and 1818, Chickasaws agreed to sell Tennessee country land, but insisted that a few individual Chickasaws would maintain control of their valuable property outside of the nation, properties that would now be under the jurisdiction of the United States. And Cherokees made similar agreements in 1817 and 1819. More specific than the Chickasaw treaties, these Cherokee agreements with the United States allowed individual Cherokees to make their own choice. They either could leave their existing property and move back into their national lands, or live outside of the Cherokee Nation on 640-acre so-called reserves that encompass their existing homesteads. And this is a map of several of these land cessions. So the section that's dark green was from an 1817 Cherokee cession. Dark yellow was from 1819, and orange was also from 1819 cession. So I'm talking about pretty much this area. So what I'm talking about is, let's say there was a Native person who was living, I don't know where Athens, Tennessee is today, and so she decided, well, I want to remain with my Cherokee kin, and I'm going to move south back into this area, which was included in the Cherokee Nation still. Or, on the other hand, she could have said, I want to continue living here at my farm, at my homestead, and I'm going to apply for one of these reserves and take out land individually and own it as property, just as white Americans who were living around her would have been. So that would have been the case for any Cherokee who was living in this part of the nation had that option here. And the inclusion of individual reserves of 640 acres in the treaties was especially significant for both Native and U.S. negotiators. Charles Hicks, he was a prominent member of the Cherokee National Council. He admitted that this cession of 1817 will disturb a large portion of our citizens, but we could find in the liberality of the government in providing for them by reservations. Hicks knew that Cherokees lived on these ceded lands, but he demanded that the federal government acknowledge their property rights. 3 years earlier, members of the Cherokee National Council had ruled that Cherokee leaders had no right to dispossess any Cherokee whatever of his improvements without his consent. Improvements, sort of a catch-all term for like a cabin, a home, a farm, that sort of thing. So thus, the 1819 Cherokee Treaty's recognition of Native individuals' personal property rights aligned with Cherokee notions of individual land ownership in the second decade of the 19th century. By possessing a reserve within the ceded territory, a Cherokee would be able to live on such an estate, continued Charles Hicks, or move elsewhere and lease it for his benefit as he should think proper. So these Cherokee treaties, they sparked a new era of Native border making in the Tennessee country by allowing Cherokees to exercise individual property rights outside of their nation's boundaries. And Cherokees began securing their individual property in the immediate aftermath of the 1819 treaty. In June, for example, a Cherokee named Eight Killer, he traveled to the Cherokee Agency, which was located along the Hiwassee River, and there he submitted an application for a reserve on a place that he settled along Fire Gizzard Creek, which is a branch of Battle Creek that flowed south into the Tennessee River in what's now Marion County. Cherokee Elizabeth Pack likewise made an application for a reserve. As required by the treaty, Pack dutifully informed the U.S. agent for the Cherokee Nation that she wished to secure ownership of her property. And she writes here, this is her application to the federal Indian agent, the Cherokee Indian agent, for one of these reserves. She says, "It is my intention," she stated, "to continue to reside permanently on the land reserved to me in the said treaty." And 7 months later, a team of American surveyors, they arrived at Pack's home near the present-day town of Jasper and marked her reserve on the Tennessee country's landscape in accordance with their instructions. This is that document. So this is a survey of Elizabeth Pack's 640-acre reserve. You can see it's included here. That's where the survey would have started because there's a finger pointing to the starting point of the reserve. And so, I'm not an expert in the surveying process, but this explains how the survey, took place. 640 acres is included here, and this happens to be square. Many of these other reserves were not square. As long as they had 640 acres, that is what counted as one of the reserves. It's also really important to note how valuable this piece of property would have been. It makes sense that Elizabeth Pack wouldn't necessarily want to just give this piece of property up. If you can see, there's a spring here, and there's a creek that travels and would have watered her land, making it very valuable for agriculture. It's also located along that Tennessee-Georgia road that I was just talking about. So travelers would have been, moving through Pack's property, and it's likely she had a partnership with a Cherokee leader who passed away a couple years before this to operate sort of a hotel or one of these roadside lodgings there on her property. So the Georgia road's here. There's also the road here called the Valley Road that would have gone north into the Sequatchie Valley. So if you're thinking about the fact that this is actually an extremely valuable piece of property that Pack would have wanted to preserve. And you can find these are have been they haven't been digitized, but they're available at the Tennessee State Library in Nashville, so you can look at all those. Yeah.
So can you help me understand, because that treaty, that 18
Yes.
treaty. So when I read it, I thought it meant like what you have here, we will give you there, right? The equivalent of what you own here.
Oh, so it's like you can stay where you are, or and some people kind of like some Cherokee individuals like didn't really live on this land, but they were able to sort of select a parcel of property for themselves.
So did they have to pay for it?
No, they didn't have to pay for it. Yeah, they just had to sort of tell the federal official, "Hey, I'm here. I want you to come and survey it, and give me this document to prove that it is in fact my property." Yeah, and it's even more complicated than that. So like the 1870, I didn't want to get like. We don't really have to get in the weeds, but the 1817 treaty allowed Cherokee individuals to sort of apply like 8-Killer did, but Elizabeth Pack was actually included specifically in the 1819 treaty, listed as someone who was going to have a reserve. So there's a little bit differences between those two treaties themselves, but I think together they both show how Native Americans were taking property individually. Yeah.
How would a reserve be like a deed?
Essentially, yeah, it would have been recognized as personal property. Yeah.
And would they be able, didn't she convey it to Jasper or something like
Yes, in fact, yes. So, and this is my father who's read the book, probably a dissertation too. So he knows where I'm going before I get there, I think. So I'm including Elizabeth Pack's story, her story is in the epilogue of my book, and her life is really, really fascinating, and I'm beginning the process of thinking about a second book, and it's going to focus on this area of Marion County, what was near the Nickajack area. The town of Nickajack was particularly important, and so that's going to be the focus of the second project. So I did choose Elizabeth Pack because I think her story is really fascinating. But to get there, so overall, nearly 350 Cherokees, they received reserves under the terms of the 1817 and 1819 treaties. And yes, almost all of Cherokee owners of such reserves eventually lost their property over the course of the 1820s, as states sold the ceded land to white buyers without acknowledging Cherokees' rights, and as white vigilantes drove Native families back into the nation. So over the summer, I was looking into, there's a tremendous number of legal documents dealing with these questions, because these were not the state didn't guarantee these lands to these Native individuals. It was the federal government. So like North Carolina fights the fact that Cherokee reservees had all this land in what's now western North Carolina. So it's a really fascinating and long and drawn out complicated legal process that I quickly realized I didn't want to get to, at least for the final copy of the book. But Elizabeth Pack's story, it's especially notable. In July of 1821, she sold 40 acres of her reserve to commissioners of Marion County for $1. So it was essentially a donation. And they established the new county seat of Jasper on this land. This summer, my wife and I did some research in Chattanooga, and we also had a wedding in Nashville. So we were down here, and I went to Jasper and looked at this marker. This is a historic marker. It's on the square of the courthouse in Jasper. So based on this, you see, let's celebrate the fact that Elizabeth Pack, Betsy Pack, donated this land to create the county seat of Jasper. But the story is much more maybe not interesting, it's more complicated. Soon, Marion County's residents, they soon turned against Elizabeth Pack, their early benefactor. When she was sued in 1823 over a fraudulent contract, Elizabeth Pack's lawyer sought a change in venue for her court case. And he said this. He petitioned to the state legislature to have a change in venue. He said that the reservation made for her under the 1890 treaty had excited strong prejudice in the minds of many of the people who have settled the territory acquired by the treaty. The outcome of this lawsuit is unclear, but the fact that Peck worried about Marion County residents' impartiality, I think, is really revealing. Despite her apparent generosity in establishing the town of Jasper 2 years later, Peck believed that she would not receive a fair trial among the community's white inhabitants because she had been an owner of a reserve, the reserve that she had then donated to the town of Jasper. Peck soon sold all of her property in Tennessee and moved to the portion of the Cherokee Nation in present-day Alabama, and there she lived with her family until the time of removal. So she took this valuable reserve and then was never able to really benefit, I guess we could say, from it. It's certainly like within the few years after taking it. But nevertheless, generations of native inhabitants of the Tennessee country had been bounding their national territories. And it should come as little surprise that some Cherokees, like 8Killer, like Elizabeth Peck, and 350 other ones, sought to create a border around their individual lands in territory ceded to the United States. Whew. So that's the meat of the argument here. I know that was a lot of information, and trust me, if you're excited for more complicated detail, you can find it right there. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I think we should have some time when I finish to answer even more questions. But before I end, I have to talk about this. I always ask my students, I tell them, we talk about, why does this history matter? Why should we care? We're sitting here in Knoxville in 2025. Why should we care about this history that happened 200 years ago? And first, big picture. I think very few Americans recognize the historical and ongoing impact of Native peoples to the history of the United States. And from a most basic sense, I hope that my book will help inform them about some of this history. More specifically, though, the issue of native land rights is really relevant today. In 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Native Nations treaty boundaries, specifically those of the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Muskogee Creeks, and Choctaws and Seminoles, remain valid for purposes of jurisdiction. So on Google Maps right now, viewers can see the present-day reservation boundaries of these Native peoples. And because land, boundaries, and property are also central to my project, I believe that my book can help inform Americans that Native Americans' present-day demand for clear borders and territorial control is not new, but reaches far back into the earliest years of the United States. Today, Native peoples want to own and control their own land without interference from federal, state, or local governments, as has been the case since before the United States came into existence. And on a more local note, many people here in East Tennessee learned about this history's relevance last year. On September 18th, 2024, exactly a year ago today, the U.S. Board on Geographic Names, notably with support from the Knox County Commission, complied with a petition by citizens of the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians and renamed Clingman's Dome, to the highest point in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, to Kewohi, meaning mulberry place in the Cherokee language. I haven't seen the signage. I guess I was here last time I was in East Tennessee was in May, but I don't think the signage was up then, so I'm excited to check this out when I can this trip down here. And for several years, members of the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, again, who still make their homes here in the Tennessee country today, they've been calling for the restorations of the peak's original Cherokee name. Levita Hill and Mary Missy Crow, there were two members of the Eastern Band who kind of led this initiative and generated support among the Eastern Band and many of the county commissions in the surrounding area of the Great Smoky Mountains. They said this. They said that Kewohi was much more appropriate than Clingman's Dome because the mountain holds historical and spiritual significance for the Cherokee people. And they argue that from time immemorial, the landscape, including the mountains and streams, has shaped our history as Cherokee people. And their successful restoration of Kewohi as the peak's name is a contemporary acknowledgement of this history. Now nearly all visitors to the nation's most visited national park will encounter the lasting presence of Native sovereignty on the landscape of the Tennessee country today. So as my book shows, Native Americans' notions of space and territory defined the landscape of the Tennessee country long before white intruders drove Cherokees and Chickasaws from their national lands. And I think Cherokee's efforts to restore the region's indigenous nomenclature, like changing Clingman's Dome to Kewohi, demonstrate how Native people's understandings of space and territory continue to impact the Tennessee country in the present day, as was the case in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
So these reservations, these were grants from
From the federal government. Mm-hmm.
And then, so where would they have been recorded? And do they still have relevance in a chain of title today as you would go back?
Yeah, I don't know about the chain. I don't think they have relevance in a chain of title today because I think they were invalidated by state courts pretty quickly, and it was clear that the federal government wasn't willing to like fight for many of these native landowners. But they're recorded at the National Archives, so you can go and look at all of these documents. There's copies at the Tennessee Historical Society or the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville. But it's really fascinating to see like where some of these are located. And there were some Native people who, as I said, Elizabeth Pack's story is probably more common than otherwise, that Native people did stay on these properties. But there are several of these reserves that remained in the hands of Cherokee families until the 1840s and 1850s. I haven't like researched into specific ones, but when you look at some of the deeds and documents from like McMinn County, for example, there's some that are still there and still relevant, recorded sort of diligently in the county records of those counties.
So at the time that the Indian Removal Act was passed,
Mm-hmm.
was that what kind of eliminated these rights?
So, for some of the people, no. I mean, essentially, it was like we're living in the state of Tennessee with the same rights as free people of color. So they wouldn't have been able to vote for the most part, but they would have been able to own property, and that would have been recognized by Tennessee law or North Carolina law or Georgia law in general, right? I mean, sometimes it wasn't enforced necessarily, but yeah, they did have property rights essentially, even though removal was happening. Mm-hmm.
So they,
Yeah.
so they got to stay.
Yeah.
If they had a reserve.
In theory, I mean, many of them, like Elizabeth Pack's story, like in addition to what happens to her with City of Jasper, there's like a white man who marries a Cherokee woman, and they sort of petition the state government to say that that's actually their property, and essentially it's not clear like why she actually moved to Alabama, but to me it's like it's not worth this, and they're like people that are coming to her house and breaking up her property and stuff, and she doesn't have any legal recourse to do that. Because again, as I said, people of color could own free people of color could own property in Tennessee whether they were Native or African American, but they couldn't testify in court, so it'd be hard to like make a legal argument if you weren't able to testify over in court about what was happening to you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
No, you had your hand up.
Oh. Okay.
You mentioned earlier that the U.S. government was willing to mobilize in Ohio, but not so much here. Was
Mhm.
that terrain and geography, or was that?
The federal government, as I said, was like cash strapped, and again, this is like, I think this is true to some extent. I mean, it's true, but it's more about the cynical interpretation of our founders. Some of them, right? But many of the founders were speculators in land in Ohio, and so they owned, in their minds, what this land that was theirs. So they had a financial incentive to say, hey, well, we don't own land in the South, because there literally weren't that many, like, there were land speculators in North Carolina that owned land in Tennessee, but they didn't have the same type of clout in like the Continental Congress or the first few United States Congresses. So they were like, let's mobilize the federal troops there and get that land because we're powerful and we kind of own this land. We're in the South.
That's our money.
I mean, and that's why like the federal government also surveyed the Midwest in grids, whereas in Tennessee, I mean, I flew over the Midwest yesterday. You look down and it's like, oh my gosh, everything's a square. But if you get in the South, that's not necessarily the case because the way the land was marked by Congress made it easier to sell later on to American settlers. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering about those applications, the applications to get a reserve.
Yes.
What would that be called if I'm trying to find it?
I think it would be applications for reserves under the 1817.
Okay.
I can give you like the exact citation information. Yeah, that is, there's, I believe, where did this source come from? I think this is also from a collection in the Tennessee State Library. I'm pretty sure that's there that has these applications that are copies, but it might be from the National Archives. I can look it up and like give you the exact citation information.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's just called applications.
Applications for reserves, yeah, something like that. So there's a volume that includes like all of these documents just like this. It might be at the National Archives actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
I believe it was the Treaty of 1801 that you were talking
Uh-huh.
about. When Tennessee was already a state.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my impression that the original boundaries of Tennessee were what they are today,
Mhm.
roughly.
Yeah.
Okay, but yet, I think you pointed to West Tennessee and said that was Chickasaw territory, and that in this treaty, the Chickasaw ended up with that.
Uh-huh.
Yet it was part of the state of Tennessee.
Yeah.
How did that work?
I think that's the complicated part. So, like North Carolina possessed a charter that said it owned all the land, essentially up to the Mississippi River. So when North Carolina ceded its land to the United States in 1789, and then the Southwest Territory was created in 1790, it's like on the one hand you have these colonies that are claiming this land, right? That it's like granted in their charter, but at the same time you have the federal government that's saying that's also native land as well. So it's like Native people would have said this is our land, we're living here. Many non-Native people would have said, well, this is in our colonial charter, but nobody ever asked Cherokees and Chickasaws to approve of this colonial charter. So it sort of like shows future ideas about Indian removal, I guess, that we can see happening really early on, 1730s, 1740s, for example. But I think that's a really, it is really complicated because you have multiple claims on the land. But I think the key thing is that no one ever asked Native Americans, got their approval to then like claim this land. I mean, imagine it's like, I have a house the first time, I'm a new homeowner, but like nobody can come and say, well, this is mine, but before it was yours, because it's essentially my land. But so if somebody wanted to do something on my property, they'd have to ask my permission. But nobody asked the permission of Cherokees and Chickasaws before they kind of assumed control over those territories.
So even though that was the state of Tennessee at that time,
Mhm.
Chickasaw would have thought, what? Yeah, it's the state of Tennessee, but we own this.
But we own this parcel, yes.
In the state of
Mhm.
Tennessee.
That's exactly right, yeah. And I think it's true, like the federal government, I mean, I see at least earlier on federal officials, especially in the South, being more willing to recognize Native Americans' boundaries and saying, yeah, like we support our constituents who are, American citizens, but we're not going to mobilize against Native peoples for war or whatever. So you need to stay off their lands. I mean, with the British, the same thing after the French and Indian War with the Proclamation of 1763, saying we recognize that a lot of conflict happens when Native Americans and white Americans are sort of confronting one another, when white Americans are making settlements on Native American land. So we've got to prevent it. I think the thing is that the United States was didn't have enough power to certainly didn't have the will, but also didn't have the power to do so. There weren't many federal troops at all in this time period.
Until Andy Jackson came along.
Pretty much. I mean, I think Andrew Jackson is more representative of how many Americans thought about this history. I think, like, it wasn't his idea, right? Indian removal wasn't Andrew Jackson's idea, but it was all these people that were living here that he was growing up with and sort of seeing and understanding. So it's not like he came to power and thought this is what should be done. It's sort of like he represented this long push for removal that had happened, I mean, as early as 1790s, I would say. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did it come?
You've read the book. You know the answers.
This is softball. They'll be interested in the answer. How did it come?
Well, we'll see, I guess. Yeah.
It hurt me to learn this. How did it come about that Knoxville was made the center of the territory south of the River Ohio when William Blount was the governor?
So it doesn't make sense that Knoxville was the first capital of the state of Tennessee, but that doesn't make any sense based on where most of the people were living at the time of the territory southwest of the River Ohio was created. But William Blount, who was a politically connected person from eastern North Carolina, he owned land. He speculated in land, so he owned all these claims to land around what's now Knoxville. And he said, "I want to increase my land's value, so I'm going to establish the city here." Because Jonesboro would have been the most ideal place. This place that would make Jonesboro or Greenville would have ideally been the place that made the most sense for the capital of the territory of the Southwest Territory or the state of Tennessee, because they were much larger. But William Blount owned parcels of land in and around here and thought they'll be more valuable if more white Americans are living there.
What is like the scale of that population relative to like the Cherokee and Chickasaw?
Yeah. So when the Southwest Territory became the state of Tennessee, it had to have 60,000 residents, and it had like 70,000. The Cherokee and the Chickasaws were known for being extremely powerful, but not very populous. There were not very many Chickasaws at this time at all, and they would recognize this. So I don't know as far as like Exact figures, I would say like around 20,000 Chickasaws and maybe 60,000 Cherokees. That's totally a rough estimate, so would be. And the Cherokees also had experienced several dramatic losses in population as a result of things that happened in the Anglo-Cherokee War, which happened in the 1750 or late 1750s and early 1760s, and then there was like several disease outbreaks. So their population was increasing at this time period because it had really gone into a real downturn like 20 years earlier from this. Yeah. But I think that's a really important question to think about. There were more, according to some data that I have, there were more soldiers, people that were listed as warriors of Cherokees and Chickasaws than there were all federal troops in 1786. So all the federal army that were federal troops, not state troops or territorial militia, there were more Cherokee and Chickasaw soldiers than there were federal troops. So think about the weakness of the federal government. I think that's really revealing. Oh, yeah.
I'm not trying to be contrarian at all to what you're saying, but like, is that just because all men of fighting age belonging to these populations were considered warriors, whereas like American?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point too, Hillary. Yeah, I totally agree. Would say that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, also the federal government, again, after the revolution, they didn't have any money to pay any of the federal troops. So it's like, we want to save, we don't have the money to pay these soldiers, so we have to get them out of federal service. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they were just truly powerless. They just weren't like being paid by the federal government. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Books are for sale in the lobby?
Great. Books are for sale in the lobby. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. This has been so great. And happy to answer any questions that y'all might have, in further conversations. But it's been great to be able to speak with you all today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.